So then the Proverbs, chapter 5 here, tells us how to walk in freedom from the forbidden. It tells us two quick things here. One is, so don't go anywhere near her. Chapter 5, verse 8, keep your way far from her. Do not go near the door of her house. Don't go into her neighborhood. Don't go into her city. Gouge out your eyes. Cut off your hand. Don't go anywhere. In Paul's language, avoid such people. You know, it's okay to avoid some people. Did you know that? Sometimes in a church today, we're told like, oh, you're going to avoid that person? Oh, you're a graceless person, aren't you? You lack forgiveness. No, I'm doing what Paul said. Some people are actually dangerous. Avoid her. The way to avoid sin and to avoid the forbidden woman, right? The way to keep yourself free from the ruin that comes from that is twofold. And the first step is very simple. Put up some doggone boundaries in your life. Have some lines that you will not cross. Have some places that you will not go. Have some people with whom you will not fraternize. Stay far away from sin, from temptation, as far away as you can. And now knowing that temptation is sure to come to you, whatever hole you might try to crawl into, but within your ability to do so, you should avoid the forbidden woman, the forbidden. Yes? But that's not going to do it alone, because you don't move toward godliness by only focusing on what you avoid, but you focus also on what you are to run to. And so the Proverbs here tells us to stay in your own lane, to focus on what you are to remain faithful to. Verse 15, drink water from your own cistern, flowing water from your own well. Should your springs be scattered abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be for yourself alone and not for strangers with you. Now, here, the water theme is a symbol of the mutual refreshment and joy and intimacy and pleasure that a husband and wife are to give to one another. Right? So here, the cistern is pictured as the woman, and the flowing river is pictured as the man. And so the idea here is that what you are to hold together between the two of you, don't share that with other people. Yes? Stay in your own lane. Remain faithful to the person to whom you've given yourself in covenant. And then verse 18, let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. A lovely deer, a graceful doe, let her breast fill you at all times with delight. Be intoxicated always in her love. And then what happens right next is it asks the question, why should you be intoxicated? And it's the same Hebrew word. Why should you be intoxicated with the forbidden woman, with the adulteress? So the whole point here is to say there is a right place for you to gain what God has designed in the covenant of marriage. In marriage, right? That's the place. There's a right place for you to experience all of the joy and the delight and the intimacy and the partnership and the fellowship. And that place is in your marriage. That's where you are. And even it goes so far as to say that that's the place. May you always be intoxicated. The word means to stagger, to stumble. It's like, may you have such delight in your spouse that you actually can be vulnerable, that you can actually have an ecstatic experience. Right? May you experience that always with your covenant partner and not with other people. Yes? God has given spouses to one another for this very purpose. So the command here is to never give that or take that from somewhere else. Now, this has to do with adultery in the sense of an actual illicit sexual affair, yes? But it's not just that, because there are other things that actually take you away from faithfulness to your spouse, yes? Like what? Like pornography, for example. Now, This is not just about pornography because it's not just about sex. It's about a covenant relationship between a husband and wife that is unique and exclusive. And that doesn't mean that we can have no meaningful relationships apart from our spouse. Right? That's not the biblical view of marriage. It does not call you to have no relationships with anyone else. It calls you to a few things. A priority of relationship with your spouse that comes before all others. It calls you to an exclusivity of relationship with your spouse that refuses to share some things with others. And it calls you to a depth of relationship with your spouse that goes deeper than all others. That's what marriage is. Marriage is a relationship of priority, of exclusivity, and depth that goes beyond any of your other relationships that you have. Not to say that you don't have any other relationships. Are we tracking? And so if I can speak directly to men, right? What does this mean? Men, you are commanded to live in committed covenant with your wife. A relationship that is unique and exclusive and that cannot be shared with anyone else. God has designed you to find a kind of fulfillment and joy and pleasure and delight in your marriage covenant that you cannot find and must not look for anywhere else. So you are not to substitute the covenant faithfulness of your wife for another woman or the fantasy of another woman. Does that make sense? Now, does Proverbs 5 only benefit men? No. Okay, so women, you are commanded to live in committed covenant with your husband, a relationship that is unique and exclusive and that cannot be shared with anyone else. God has designed you to find a kind of fulfillment and joy and pleasure and delight in your marriage covenant that you cannot find and must not look for anywhere else. And so you are not to substitute the covenant relationship with your husband for another man or the fantasy of another man. So however that can happen in an actual affair. What's the problem with an affair? What's the damage that it does? You've quite literally traded your spouse, who you find to be deficient, for somebody else who in your fantasy and delusion you don't think is deficient. And you do incredible harm when you do that. Yes? But that's the problem with pornography too. You've traded your spouse, whom you find to be deficient in some way, for someone else who in your fantasy and your delusion you don't find deficient. You look for something that you should gain from your spouse somewhere else. You look for intimacy. You look for connection. You look for somebody to desire you how you want to be desired, but you don't find that in your spouse, or you don't think you find that in your spouse, or you're not willing to even have the conversation with your spouse. You're not willing to seek counseling with your spouse. You're not willing to do whatever work you need to do to repair things with your spouse. And so you just take the easy way out and you go somewhere else and you get that thing that you think you deserve, that you need, that you want. And you have been a traitor to your spouse. But that's not even the only way that it happens. I have a great concern in our culture that there is an understated threat that many women will engage in. There are certain kinds of books that many women in our culture will read, and they will feel no problem reading them because they'll say it's not pornography and it's not an affair. But the reality is, they're reading these books exactly because they give them a kind of feeling of intimacy, of romance, of connection that they want their husbands to give them, but they don't have. And so you'll have these, I don't know the best way to categorize these works. Like erotic, I call them smutty. I can't think of a better word. But these books, okay, can I just call that out here and say, like, it's a different expression of something. It's not as visceral to many people's imagination as, say, pornography, But I'm going to suggest that it is equally as damaging and equally as wrong. Because I still think what's happening there is you are trading the reality of who God has given you to cultivate connection with and intimacy with and vulnerability with and faith with and a family with, and you're trading that person because you find them deficient, and you're finding what you find deficient in them somewhere else. And frankly, I find that just as traitorous as anything else. I find that to be flirting with the forbidden person. Right? I think that this covenant faithfulness is the biblical sexual ethic. Full stop. That's it. So then my exhortation to us, right, is spouses, give this to one another.